Could a bomber sink a warship by skipping a bomb across the water like a flat stone? In early 1943, the idea was considered not just radical, but suicidal. Yet for one man, it was the only option left. At 0630 on the morning of March 1, 1943, Major Ed Larner stood on the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby, the humid New Guinea air thick with the smell of aviation fuel and impending conflict. He watched his B-25 Mitchell bomber crews prepare for a mission that higher command had already dismissed as impossible. At 31 years old, with 72 combat missions under his belt, Larner was a veteran, but a frustrated one. His logbook recorded a grim statistic: 0 ships sunk. The reason for this mission and for the desperation driving it was steaming through the Bismarck Sea. Japanese intelligence had been compromised. American code breakers had intercepted messages detailing the departure of a massive convoy from Rabaul. 8 heavily laden troop transports and 8 formidable destroyers were en route, carrying nearly 7,000 fresh soldiers to reinforce the Japanese garrison at Leh. Every single transport that reached its destination meant another division the Allies would have to dig out of the unforgiving jungle, with blood, bayonets, and unbearable losses. Larner's problem was a brutal exercise in physics and futility. Traditional bombing from a relatively safe altitude of 10,000 feet gave enemy ships far too much time to maneuver. Experienced Japanese captains would watch the American bombers climb, coolly calculate the bomb's trajectory based on altitude and airspeed, and then calmly turn their vessels away from the projected splash zones. For 8 long months, the 5th Air Force's B-17s had been trying to hit Japanese convoys with this method. Their hit rate was a pathetic 3%. Most bombs exploded harmlessly in the empty ocean, sending up colossal geysers of white water while the targeted ships steamed onward, untouched. The mathematics were as unforgiving as the enemy. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from medium altitude took 37 seconds to reach the water. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer traveling at 30 knots could cover 380 yards, a distance greater than 3 football fields. The bombardier aimed at where the ship was. The bomb invariably hit where the ship used to be. Larner had witnessed this failure on mission after mission. His bombers would return to base with perfect bombing photographs showing tight, symmetrical patterns of explosions around the ships, always around them, never on them. Frustrated crews would report direct hits that, upon review, turned out to be near misses, the concussions rocking the ships but leaving their hulls intact. The Japanese kept sailing. American bomber losses kept climbing. In the past month alone, his squadron had lost 4 aircraft trying to hit convoys. 40 men vanished into the vast Pacific. Japanese は, for their part, shot down high-altitude bombers with methodical, chilling precision. Their gunners had ample time to track the bomber's steady approach, calculate the lead, and bracket the entire formation with a lethal curtain of flak. By the time the bombs began their long fall, half the attacking squadron was often already burning, spiraling down towards the very ships they had failed to destroy. Something had to change, or the war in New Guinea would be lost. The proposed change came from General George Kenney, the audacious commander of the 5th Air Force. It was an idea that sounded like pure insanity to every pilot who heard it. Skip the bomb across the water like a flat stone. The plan was as simple as it was terrifying. Fly in at a wave-hugging altitude of 50 feet. Release the bomb 300 yards out, armed with a 5-second delay fuse. Let the bomb's own momentum carry it across the surface of the sea. It would skip once, maybe twice, then slam into the ship's hull, detonating on contact or just beneath the waterline for maximum damage. The theorists in their offices insisted it would work. The pilots who had to fly the mission were convinced it was suicide. flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet above the ocean swells, straight into the teeth of a warship bristling with anti-aircraft guns, violated every survival instinct Larner had painstakingly developed over his 72 missions. Japanese destroyers were floating fortresses, carrying 127mm main guns, rapid-firing 25mm machine cannons, and dozens of lighter weapons. Every single one of them could easily track and destroy a bomber at that altitude. One solid hit to an engine and the B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could even register what had happened. Twice, higher command had explicitly banned the tactic. It was deemed too dangerous, too experimental, and entirely unproven. Larner's formal requests to practice skip bombing had been denied in December and again in January. The official response was a stern rebuke, calling the idea a reckless disregard for equipment and personnel, and ordering crews to focus on proven high-altitude tactics. But those proven tactics were not sinking ships. Larner walked to the operations tent and spread the latest reconnaissance photographs across the planning table. The Japanese convoy had been spotted at dawn, steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea. The images were stark. 8 fat transports arranged in 2 neat columns, with destroyers screening their flanks like wolves guarding sheep. Every one of those ships was packed to the gunwales with soldiers, artillery, and ammunition. If those transports reached Lae, the grueling war in New Guinea would grind on for another bloody year. Larner had an idea, a forbidden one, that would either vindicate General Kenny's faith in low-altitude attacks or get 60 American airmen killed before lunch. The convoy would pass within striking range at 900.
He had 3 hours to prepare, 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly like they had never flown before. Calling his squadron leaders to the tent, Larner laid out the very plan they had been forbidden to practice. The B-25 Mitchell was a magnificent aircraft, but it was never designed for what Larner was now demanding. The bomber had been built to hit targets from medium altitude in a stable, level bombing approach. Its twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to 300 miles an hour, but that speed was meaningless if Japanese gunners had 30 seconds to draw a bead on it. General Kenny's radical modification, however, changed everything. Mechanics of the 5th Air Force had ripped out the bombardier's position in the glass nose of the B-25 and replaced it with a fearsome array of 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. With 4 in the nose and 4 more in blisters on the fuselage sides, the B-25 had been transformed into a flying gun platform, capable of putting 200 rounds of heavy machine gun fire into a target every second. The theory was brutally simple. Suppress the ship's anti-aircraft gunners with a tidal wave of lead during the final approach. Give them a compelling reason to duck. Make them choose between returning fire and staying alive. Larner had watched his own mechanics bolt these gun packs onto his aircraft 3 weeks earlier. The modification added 1,200 pounds, shifting the bomber's center of gravity forward. It turned his reliable bomber into something new and untested, a hybrid between a heavy attack aircraft and a maritime strike fighter. It was a machine that had never existed before. The practice runs had been conducted in near total secrecy. General Kenny had found them a target, the wreck of the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nata Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The rusting hulk sat half-submerged in the shallow water, a perfect stationary target. Larner's crews flew their practice runs at dawn and dusk, when the poor light and few observers would shield their forbidden activities. They learned to skim the wave tops at 270 miles an hour. They drilled the precise timing of the bomb release. And they learned firsthand what happened when you got it wrong. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett had gotten it wrong on February 16th. He'd come in too high at 70 feet instead of 50. His bomb had skipped twice, cleared the Pruth entirely, and detonated uselessly 300 yards beyond the wreck. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, had immediately recalculated. Lower, faster, a closer release point. On the next run, Fawcett came in at a breathtaking 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the Pruth's hull just below the waterline. It struck precisely where a warship's magazine would be, the exact spot where a single bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of ammunition and blow a destroyer in half. But the Pruth wasn't shooting back. Now, Larner spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table and pointed to the lead transport, 800 feet long, displacing 10,000 tons, capable of carrying 1,500 troops. It was the convoy's flagship. Every officer in the tent understood what was at stake. Japanese reinforcements had turned the battle for Buna into a 6-month nightmare that had cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Leh, if those transports unloaded, would be infinitely worse. The physics of skip bombing demanded a level of precision most bomber crews had never even attempted. Approach altitude, 50 feet above the water. Approach speed, 270 miles per hour. Release point, 300 yards from the target. Bomb trajectory angle, 8 degrees. Delay fuse, 5 seconds. If a pilot missed any one of these variables, the bomb would either skip harmlessly over the ship, detonate short of the target, or hit the water at the wrong angle and sink without detonating. There was no margin for error. Larner assigned each pilot a specific target, Transport 1 through Transport 8. The destroyers were secondary targets, only to be engaged if the transports were already burning. No bomber would attack the same ship twice. The plan was built on maximum efficiency, maximum destruction. One pass, one bomb, one chance. The crews filed out to their aircraft at 07. 54 men in 9 B-25s. They were not alone. Behind them, 13 Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would strafe the convoy first, their cannons intended to suppress the initial anti-aircraft fire. High above them, 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would bomb from altitude, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver and break up their protective formations. And higher still, P-38 Lightning fighters would keep the deadly Japanese Zeros busy. But the killing blow, if it came, would be delivered by Larner's 9 bombers at 50 feet. He climbed into his aircraft at 07:15. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already running through the pre-flight checklist, his voice a calm monotone in the tense cockpit. The bombardier, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, was checking the bomb release mechanism for the 4th time. Nobody spoke more than was necessary. The entire crew had flown together for 9 months. They knew what a 50-foot approach meant. They knew the odds. Larner started the port engine, then the starboard. The right cyclones coughed to life and settled into their familiar deafening roar. Around him on the hard stand, 8 other B-25s were winding up. The formation would take off in flights of 3, Larner's flight first. The orders were simple: stay low over the water the entire way. Japanese radar was ineffective at tracking aircraft below 100 feet. Surprise was the only real advantage they had. At 07:45, Larner released the brakes and his heavily laden bomber began its takeoff roll. By 9:30, he would know if General Kenny's insane theory worked, or if he had just led his entire squadron into a slaughter. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 agonizing minutes. Larner held his formation at a mere 30 feet above the ocean, so low that spray from the wave tops occasionally spattered his windscreen. The B-25s flew in a loose V formation, each aircraft separated by 200 yards, close enough to maintain visual contact, yet far enough apart that a single burst of flak couldn't take down 2 bombers. Radio silence was absolute. The Japanese monitored every frequency. A single transmission and the convoy would know they were coming. Surprise was worth more than coordination. Larner checked his watch. 08:30. The convoy should be 60 miles to the northeast, steaming at 12 knots toward the Vidia Strait, precisely on schedule according to the morning reconnaissance report. The ocean below was an endless, empty expanse of blue. Flying this low, Larner's visibility was limited to no more than 5 miles. The convoy could be anywhere. His navigation had to be perfect. 5 degrees off course and they would miss the target entirely. Approach from the wrong angle and the destroyers would have ample time to bring their main guns to bear. At 08:52, a smudge appeared on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust, the unmistakable signature of 16 ships steaming in formation. Larner keyed his throat microphone once. A single click, the signal to tighten formation. His wingmen acknowledged with their own single clicks. Radio discipline was holding. The convoy took shape as they closed the distance. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. The destroyers formed a protective screen 2 miles ahead and on both flanks. Through his binoculars, Larner counted the gun positions on the nearest destroyer. 6 main turrets, dozens of smaller weapons. Every one of those guns would be tracking his approach the moment they broke the horizon. At 08:57, the first phase of the plan began. The bowfighters went in. Larner watched from 3 miles out as 13 Australian aircraft dove on the convoy from the northeast, their 20mm cannons raking the decks of the destroyers. Bright tracer rounds arced across the water. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat, their barrels spitting fire. It was working exactly as planned. The bowfighters weren't there to sink ships. They were there to make the Japanese gunners look in the wrong direction. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived at 10,000 feet. Larner saw their bomb bay doors yawn open, and seconds later, bombs tumbled down towards the convoy. The Japanese ships immediately began evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port and starboard. The neat columns broke apart as spacing increased. The destroyers accelerated to flank speed, churning white water at their sterns. They were reacting, confused. It was the perfect moment. Larner pulled back on the throttles and descended to 40 feet. His airspeed dropped to 260 miles per hour. Walls, his bombardier, began calling out distances in a steady professional voice. 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship in the convoy was now clearly visible. Larner picked his target, the second transport in the port column, a 700-foot-long vessel sitting low in the water, fully loaded. His bomb would hit it amidships, right where the troop compartments were packed with soldiers. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Larner saw the bright muzzle flashes bloom from its guns. The first shells arced towards his formation but exploded high above them. The Japanese gunners were still accustomed to tracking bombers at altitude. They hadn't yet adjusted for a 50-foot approach, but they would. At 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. All 8.50 caliber machine guns hammered at once, the sound of physical concussion inside the cockpit. Tracers walked across the transport superstructure. Glass shattered in the bridge windows. Metal sparked where the heavy round struck. Men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. The anti-aircraft crews couldn't effectively shoot back while 50 caliber bullets were tearing through their positions at 800 rounds per minute. 1,200 yards. Larner's wingmen were spreading out, each bomber lining up on its assigned target. The formation was fragmenting by design, 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. There was no time for the defenders to shift their fire, no time to coordinate a response. 800 yards. The destroyer's main guns fired again. This time, the shells bracketed Larner's flight, exploding to his left and right. The B-25 was rocked by the concussions. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage like angry hornets. Benz, the co-pilot, called out, "Damage, port engine oil pressure dropping, but still in the green." 600 yards. The transport filled Larner's entire windscreen, a mountain of gray steel. He could see individual soldiers on deck scrambling for cover. He could see the ship's gun crews frantically swinging their weapons toward him. Every instinct screamed at him to pull up, to climb, to get away from the wall of steel rushing toward him at a combined closing speed of over 300 miles per hour. 400 yards. Wall's voice cut through the engine roar, sharp and clear. Bomb armed, ready for release. 300 yards. Larner pressed the bomb release button. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds of high explosive dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by its momentum. It struck the water nose first, skipped once like a perfectly thrown stone, and arrowed directly toward the transport's hull. Larner pulled back hard on the control yoke, climbing steeply. Behind him, the 5-second fuse was counting down. The bomb detonated precisely at the waterline. Larner didn't see the explosion. He was climbing hard, his vision filled with nothing but blue sky. But he felt it. The shock wave hit his aircraft like a physical blow, lifting the tail and throwing the B-25 sideways. Benz fought the controls to level him out. The altimeter spun wildly through 100 feet, 200, 300. Risking a glance back, Larner saw a scene of utter devastation. The transport was splitting open. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from its midsection as the hull buckled with a shriek of tortured metal. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship was listing heavily to port, already taking on massive amounts of water through the gaping hole torn in its side. Soldiers were jumping overboard, dozens of them, tiny figures abandoning a dying ship. One bomb, 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. The skip bombing worked. To Larner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett's bomber was pulling up from its own attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Captain Bill Hayes had just released his bomb on a destroyer. The bomb skipped twice and hit below the aft turret. The destroyer's stern lifted clear out of the water from the force of the internal explosion. When it crashed back down, the entire rear third of the ship was simply gone. The destroyer began settling by the stern, sinking with astonishing speed. 4 targets had been hit in the first 90 seconds. The Japanese convoy was in chaos, but the defenders were already adapting. A destroyer on the far flank had turned to face the bombers, its main guns firing in rapid succession. The shells walked across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards, the second by 20. The third hit. Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated in a flash of orange and black. The bomb still under its fuselage detonated on impact, vaporizing the bomber instantly. There were no parachutes, no survivors. 5 men, gone between one heartbeat and the next. Larner watched the debris scatter across the water, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. There was no time to process it, no time to mourn. The attack was still unfolding. The remaining B-25s pressed their attacks with grim determination. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport, the convoy flagship. His approach was textbook, 50 feet, 270 miles per hour, machine guns blazing. The Japanese crew was firing back with everything they had, 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air between Johnson's bomber and the transport was a solid web of tracers. Johnson's bomb release was perfect. The weapon skipped once and punched through the transport's hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse gave it time to penetrate deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion tore through 3 decks. Fire erupted from the cargo holds, holds that Larner knew were filled with ammunition, artillery shells, and fuel drums. The transport became a floating inferno. Men were burning on the deck, jumping into the sea, trailing smoke. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber took multiple hits during its approach. A Japanese gunner on one of the destroyers had finally adjusted for the low-altitude attack. 20mm shells ripped through Warren's port wing, and fuel began streaming from the punctured tank. Warren held his course. 300 yards, 200. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped and struck the transport below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing a plume of fire. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, was already activating the fire suppression system. The flames died, but the bomber was crippled, barely staying in the air. 6 transports were now burning or sinking. 2 destroyers were damaged. 1 B-25 was lost. The entire attack had lasted just 4 minutes. But it wasn't over. The second wave was coming in. 9 more B-25s from the 90th Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Chell. They had watched Larner's attack from 5 miles out. They knew the tactic worked. They also knew the cost. Chell's formation spread out, each bomber selecting a target from the ship still afloat. The Japanese were ready this time. Every gun in the convoy that could still fire was tracking low across the water. The destroyers had formed a defensive line, their main batteries firing in coordinated volleys. The ocean erupted with shell splashes, creating a deadly, calculated barrage. The Japanese had learned from the first attack. They would make the Americans pay for the second. Chell's bomber came in from the east, flying directly out of the sun. It was a smart move. The Japanese gunners were half-blinded, firing at shadows. His bomb hit a transport that was already listing, the explosion accelerating its demise. The ship rolled completely onto its side and went under in less than 2 minutes. 1,200 soldiers went down with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as lucky. His approach angle was wrong, too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up and circled for another run, a fatal mistake. The Japanese destroyer he had missed tracked him through the entire turn. When Jensen came around for his second pass, the warship was waiting. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 miles per hour. There was no explosion, just a brutal impact. The ocean swallowed the aircraft and kept moving. 2 bombers down, 7 transports sinking, 3 destroyers crippled. The battle had been raging for 8 minutes, and it was then that Larner realized with cold clarity that the Japanese still had 60 Zero fighters somewhere above the clouds, and their escort had failed to intercept them. The Zeros appeared at 09:15, 18 of them diving from 12,000 feet. Larner saw them through scattered clouds, silver shapes dropping toward the bombers like hawks on field mice. The P-38 Lightnings were supposed to have kept them occupied. Something had gone terribly wrong. Larner's B-25 was dangerously vulnerable, low on fuel and ammunition. He pushed the throttles forward and dove to wave-top height, 20 feet, then 15. The propellers were churning salt spray. The Zeros split into 2 groups. Half stayed high to engage the P-38s. The other 9 went after the bombers. They came in fast, their 20mm cannons opening up from 1,000 yards out. Larner saw tracers arc past his canopy, far too close. He jinked left, then right, making himself as difficult to target as possible. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake in the dorsal gun turret fired short, controlled bursts at the nearest Zero, forcing the Japanese fighter to break off its attack. Lieutenant Warren's damaged bomber wasn't so fortunate. A Zero latched onto his tail and stayed there. Warren tried every evasive maneuver he knew, but nothing worked. The Zero pilot was an expert. He waited until Warren ran out of airspeed in a climbing turn, then fired a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over and plunged into the ocean. Larner saw 3 parachutes blossom against the sky. 3 out of 5. It was better than nothing. The Zeros pressed their attack for 6 relentless minutes. Then, abruptly, they broke off and climbed. The B-17s were coming back for a second pass at 10,000 feet. The Zeros had to choose, attack the low-level bombers or defend what remained of the convoy from the high-altitude threat. They chose to defend the convoy. Larner used the reprieve to assess the damage. His port engine was running rough, its oil pressure fluctuating. The fuel gauge showed 60%, enough to make it back to Port Moresby, maybe. He looked back at the convoy. It was a scene of total annihilation. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. The 8th was burning but still afloat, trying to limp toward the New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screening line were damaged. 2 were dead in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The initial attack had lasted 11 minutes, but the killing would continue for 3 more days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt for survivors in lifeboats. Of the 7,000 troops the Japanese had committed to this convoy, fewer than 1,200 would ever make it to Leh. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure under the merciless tropical sun. Larner set his course for home. His formation was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers were confirmed lost. 20 men were dead or missing. But the mission had worked. Skip bombing had proven itself in the most brutal way imaginable. The technique would be refined, standardized, and taught to every bomber squadron in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would abandon any attempt to move large convoys within range of Allied air power. The supply line to their forward bases would be strangled. The tide of the war would turn. But Larner didn't know any of that yet. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, his engine was failing, and Port Moresby was 90 minutes away. At 10:10, Ben spotted land, the southern coast of New Guinea. The port engine was shaking violently now, oil streaming from a crack in its housing. Larner feathered the propeller and transferred all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed. The coast got closer. The engine held. Larner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was lined with ground crews, mechanics, and intelligence officers. Word had spread. The convoy had been annihilated. The debrief lasted 2 hours. The reconnaissance photos that arrived at 1300 confirmed the staggering victory. 7 transports sunk, the 8th beached and burning. 2 destroyers sunk, 2 severely damaged. General Kenny arrived at 1600, pointed at the photo of the beached transport and said one word: finish it. By nightfall on March 2nd, 14 of the 16 Japanese ships were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The cost in lives was catastrophic. An estimated 3,000 Japanese troops drowned or were killed by air attack. The reinforcement operation had failed utterly. American losses were 4 B-25s, 1 B-17, and 2 P-38s. 13 airmen killed. The exchange rate was absurdly one-sided. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed how every air force in the world thought about attacking ships. But for the men who flew the missions, the psychological stress was immense. Larner flew 16 more missions before rotating home in May 1943. He was offered a role training new crews in the tactic he had perfected. He refused. Instead, he transferred to transport aircraft, flying supplies for the rest of the war. He never spoke publicly about the battle. He had done what was necessary. That was enough. He died in 1997, his obituary mentioning his military service in a single sentence. It did not mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It did not mention that he and his men, flying in the face of orders and all conventional wisdom, had pioneered a tactic that helped cripple an empire. What remains is the stark truth of that day. In March 1943, a group of American bomber crews proved that aircraft could sink ships by skipping bombs across the water at 50 feet. The tactic was called suicide before they proved it worked. It was called genius afterward. The truth lay somewhere in between. It was desperation meeting innovation, and it was courage measured in the unwavering decision to fly straight into a wall of fire, because the alternative was unthinkable.